Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Really glad to be back here with everyone tonight. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure you're chatting to everyone. We love to know who's in the room with us. Let us know your name and where you're joining us from. The chat is also where you can add any questions that you have, and I will try to bring them into the conversation later in the program. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive that works to transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We especially pay attention to how gender functions in the past and present, and we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So, thank you for being our partners in this effort. The book talks are just one aspect of what JWA does. I hope you will all check out jwa.org to explore all the wonderful things that JWA has for you. If you are looking for captions, you can click the button that says Show Captions or CC and turn that on for yourself. Okay, I am so delighted to introduce this evening's author. Esther Chehebar is the author of Sisters of Fortune, and she is a mother of three and a member of SBH, a nonprofit supporting New York's Sephardic Jewish community. Her work has regularly appeared in Tablet magazine, and her first children's book, I Share My Name, is an illustrated story celebrating the Syrian tradition of naming children after their grandparents. Sisters of Fortune is her first novel, and I am so excited to get to talk about it tonight. Welcome, Esther.
Thank you. Thanks. And thanks so much for having me and for all of you for being here. I'm excited to speak with you tonight.
Well, yeah, right. It's been a long day for you. It sounds like you've done some book work already.
It's a great way to end the day. So
So
excited.
this is a really fun book, and a really interesting book, and very much a JWA book, as I was saying before we all hopped on. It's a multi-generational story of three young women, three sisters who are growing up in the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. I would love to hear where this book started for you. Sort of how did you come to write this particular story?
So it'll probably come to no surprise to anybody that I myself did grow up and I'm still very much a part of the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. I am one of three sisters and I have a brother as well. Um, but I very much grew up ingrained in the Syrian community in Brooklyn. I went to the Sephardic yeshiva my whole life. Um, I grew up with a very unique social safety network of um, in a very unique community, and it was never a matter of if I was going to tell a story set in the community, but when. It took me a long time to write this story. I was working on it for this book for close to 8 years.
Mm.
And I felt an immense amount of pressure, but also a responsibility because I really wanted to get the community right in all of its nuances and uh, gray areas and all of its unique cultural taboos and traditions that we have. Um, and I am still a part of the community, most importantly. So, um, I still, well, I recently relocated to Jersey, but I lived in Brooklyn until very recently. My kids go to the same yeshiva that I went to growing up. And so there was a big responsibility to get this story right and to also maybe introduce the community to fellow other Jewish communities and, other Americans and other people who hadn't heard of a Syrian Jew before and who weren't familiar with our community and our customs.
Had you ever read a book before that sort of took place in your community and that had a world that was the world that you recognized from your own experience?
So actually, a friend of mine, her name is Corey Ajmi. She's a fellow Sephardic Jew. She came out with a book 2 years ago called The Marriage Box. And as far as I know, that is the only other contemporary book set in the Syrian Jewish community. Um, she's a friend. I mean, she's a little older than me, but as we were writing together over the course of many years, it feels like, we were able to bounce ideas off each other and also share some of the anxieties that we had about writing about the community. But as far as I know, her book, The Marriage Box, and Sisters of Fortune are really the only two representations in fiction of the community.
That's kind of amazing. I mean, we think at JWA all the time. A lot of our work is about representation and thinking about the power of representation and how important it is for people to see themselves reflected in the narratives around them. That's part of why we do the work that we do.
Mm.
So I can imagine it would be powerful for young people growing up now to actually have a story that they can see themselves in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I hope so. And it's been one of the most gratifying aspects of this whole process has been hearing from young women in my community who feel like, you know, not only are they seeing themselves on the page, but they feel like a lot of their ambivalence or skepticism or, thoughts, feelings, opinions were given a voice. And that's incredibly gratifying for me as a writer and as a mother and as a member of the community and as
Mm.
a woman, of course.
Did you know from the beginning that you were going to make it a story of three sisters and include all three sisters' perspectives, or was there sort of one part that you started with and built the others around?
So, no, originally the book was solely from Fortune, the middle sister's perspective. So, for those of you who haven't read the book, Fortune is the middle sister. She's engaged to be married to a very Adami, we say, which means like a nice Syrian Jewish boy. Um, and as her engagement progresses, she sort of some doubts, I'll say, and start to surface surrounding her relationship, surrounding the set of choices before her. And so originally, the book was only from Fortune's perspective, and the book actually took place entirely in the 6 days before her wedding.
Mm.
And so it was this sort of ticking time bomb leading up to her wedding, and it was like a will she or won't she go through with it. And as I got further along in the writing and eventually the editing process, the other sisters were such a big part of the story, and their voices were sort of like jumping off the page. And it almost like didn't feel fair to not have their perspectives as well. And I actually found that once I opened the book up to include all of the three sisters' perspectives, I was able to represent the community in a much, my strokes were broader and I was able to encapsulate more of the community and there was more depth to the story, more layers to the story. And to me, these three women and these three sisters, they're archetypes. They're archetypes of three different types of women in the community. Of course, there's more than three different types of women in the community, but it allowed me to uh, more accurately depict three different journeys, I guess, for these three different sisters growing up very differently, but yet still living under the same roof.
Mm. Speaking of archetypes, I know that you have been called a Jewish Jane Austen. And in fact, there's a scene in your book where Fortune picks up Pride and Prejudice and starts reading it. So I'm curious whether you were sort of aiming for a Syrian version of the Bennets.
It's very high praise. I, I definitely wasn't mad about it. Yeah, I think, you know what, I've always been, Jane Austen was one of my favorite writers in high school and, beyond high school. I've always been fascinated by the politics of marriage and especially growing up in a community where it's very common for women to get married young and to have children young. And we're kind of taught in a very, natural way from a young age, um, eventually you'll get married to a boy from the community, you'll have children, and you'll live down the block from your parents, and you're kind of in this, um, you're in this ecosystem where there's a very unique set of pressures and expectations. But then again, these are very universal themes at the same time that we all deal with as women. Maybe our timelines are a little bit different. And of course, nobody explores relationships or the politics of marriage like Jane Austen. And so there was something very exciting to me about putting a fresh spin on that and bringing it to Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn. And what would that look like for a mother and father to have to marry off three young daughters in a contemporary setting, um, and yet have some of those pressures and those expectations that feel antiquated, but are very much alive in this present society and culture.
Yeah. Um, do you want to read a little piece to give us a taste?
Sure. So I'm going to read from Fortune's perspective. So here we go. When we were little, Mom bought us an ant farm to keep the dirt out of our nails. It soon became my responsibility. Nina insisted the ants should be free, and Lucy quickly lost interest. But I loved watching them, studying their movements, however repetitive they might have been. You see, to the ants who have never known life outside of the acrylic barrier, the farm felt massive, grandiose even. The ants collectively paved each route, pummeling their tiny bodies through the sand until a viable path was formed. And they did this countless times. A path to get to the water, a path to get to the food, tiny pieces of bread and fruit that I slid in through a trapdoor at the bottom. The ants were strong, but they were also intelligent. They were efficient and hardworking, and in their quest for survival, they seized on the predictability of their small but comfortable lives. Insulated and with no imminent threat to their existence, my ants thrived and multiplied. Until one night, a stray cat jumped up on the ledge outside where I kept them and blew the whole thing to bits. Sometimes I still wonder how my little friends did on the outside, if they managed to escape at all. If there were a welcome sign upon entering the community, it would be Brooklyn, it's so convenient, followed by everything we need is here. There's the traffic and the incessant honking. The honking. Has it always been this bad? People fight and curse each other's mothers from behind the safety of their steering wheels and then smile politely in the street. Hi, honey, how are you? And your mother still in Florida? We're all in a rush to get to the store. Shabbat waits for no one. Every single one of us is a priority customer with the receipts to show for it. The trucks load and unload day and night, feeding a community whose belly never seems to fill. We pave the routes and we follow them. North, south, east, west. All roads lead to somewhere, all roads lead to nowhere. After the weekend, the garbage piles up on the sidewalk. Piles and piles of black, hefty bags that reek of lamb juice and potato scraps, cooked oil, and soiled napkins. Yesterday's meal is already a frozen memory, wrapped and stored for a busy day or an unexpected death. Time to start planning the next. All of your kids are coming, and the grandkids, the in laws, your mother. Break out the cookbooks, spring open the Rolodex, arrange the pots, set the table, and hire extra help. Let's make a menu. Do you want to hear my menu? I just can't make another menu. Complain incessantly about the menu.
Thank you. Um, Speaking of menus, food is a really big piece of this of the story. Not just food, but food culture. As you can see in that excerpt that you just read, just how much of the sense of family and home and social life revolves around food, and how much of women's lives revolve around that, which I thought was so evocative. And there's all these different food. I felt very hungry reading the book because I wanted to taste all the things. But there's also this whole other piece that is, involves the sisters and the mothers and mothers-in-laws, really focused on body image and dieting. And that was a kind of interesting tension, maybe sort of two sides of the same coin. How did you think about the relationship between those elements of the story?
Yeah, I think it's one of the greatest ironies of the book that and the culture that we spend so much time cooking and talking about food and around the table, and yet there are very apparent issues around body image, but really vanity in general. I think that um, and it's funny. I was actually listening to a Lebanese woman speak who is not Jewish, and she was talking about how upkeeping your physical appearance is like a temple of Lebanese culture. The women are very interested and into keeping up their physical appearance and taking care of themselves. And I thought to myself, in Syria, in the Syrian Jewish community, that's we kind of have something similar where it's almost like a value system to upkeep your physical appearance, stay fit, to have your hair done and have your nails done, and always, be presentable in that way. And I think when I was younger, there was a fair share of not so much resentment, but maybe a little ambivalence towards that. Like, are we all just upkeeping ourselves to hook a man, or whatever it was. And I think as I got older, I came to understand it more as like taking a sense of pride in the way that you look. And I think it's very much tied to the emphasis and the importance and the significance placed on reputation and one's name. In our community, your name is everything, and how you present yourself is everything. And if your name is tarnished, um, then really, that has ripple effects for your family and your children. Um, and a second component to that is, when you live in such close quarters with so many people, you're inevitably going to compare yourselves. And from that comes a sense of competition. And, being that there are very high stakes around marriage, and there is a competitive atmosphere around dating, um, looks, that seeps into, how you look. And there is an immense amount of pressure for women, I think, to measure up to their fellow, 21-year-old friend or 22-year-old friend. And I think that's unfortunate. That's definitely something that, uh, in the reality of my community, I think a lot of us are grappling with and trying to change and trying to work on. But it's not something I wanted to shy away from in the book, even though it's not as glossy, or it's not as, joyful as some of the other aspects. I felt like it was an important piece to include.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think we see some comments in the chat about how that those tendencies are common in a lot of communities that are insular, right?
Yeah.
Because for the reasons you said, like when you live in such close proximity and there is kind of a limited pool of people, some of those things become more um, prominent, maybe, or more kind of
Mm.
emphasized. And I think so much of the book really is about negotiating the tensions of what it is to be in a very tight-knit community, the good things and the bad things, and the whole question of like wanting to be inside but also be outside. And some of that differs based on characters, right? Like the sister Nina wants to kind of stakes her identity more on being an outsider. And then when she starts to come back in, that's a little hard for her. Fortune has always like wanted to be the good girl and do the right thing, but also feels a little trapped. Um, and there was one part where I think it was Fortune says about her grandmother and other immigrant women of her grandmother's generation that the boundaries didn't make them feel trapped, it made them feel safe. And that also felt like a really important piece of how people experience those things differently depending on their experience. Can you talk a little bit about that element of the community and the kind of inside, outside, and boundaries as a positive or a negative.
Yeah. Well, I think that piece that you just mentioned about Sita, the grandmother, saying that these boundaries made them feel safe and not trapped. Um, that's really, I think, where the meat and the tension lies because, and I, of course, did not realize this until I got older and had kids of my own, but it is a privilege to sort of want to get out and want to step out. Um, we're a newer community relative to some other, you know, Jewish communities who've emigrated to the States. There were two waves, I believe, of Syrian Jews, coming from Damascus and Aleppo to New York, and that was post 1948, so the early 1950s, post partition plan. And then the second major wave was in 1992 when the Syrian community, which had established itself in Brooklyn, really lobbied the what was then the Assad regime in Syria to allow the remaining, I think it was somewhere along the lines of like 2,000 Jews still in Damascus to come over to New York. So we're a newer community, and I think that the memory of, you know, what life was like in Syria or in Egypt. There's a very big Egyptian community sort of under the umbrella of the Sephardic Syrian community here. What life was like for the Syrians in Syria and in Egypt and some of the other Arab majority countries, that memory is still very fresh
Mm.
uh, in our minds. And there is a sense of wanting to keep the community close and wanting to keep the community insular because that's a way of securing our future and keeping us safe. Um, and I think for, you know, the grandparents and the great grandparents of my community, that fear of, um, what if life becomes untenable here? It's very prevalent still.
Right.
And for the younger generation who had sort of grown up in a community that had established itself in New York and had grown up with countless synagogues and yeshivot and grocery stores, Middle Eastern grocery stores where they could go in and buy, anything they want. We forget that. And so we feel trapped by this influx of culture, this sort of like insularity of it all. And some of us want to step outside, but of course for the older generation they see that as a blessing, not a curse by any means. And then of course you have Brooklyn as not just a setting but a real character in the book,
Hmm.
because there are so many, you know, neighborhoods, let alone there are different worlds within this within the borough of Brooklyn. And so you have this world of Syrian Jews, which can feel, suffocating at times, but can also feel incredibly safe. There's that duality. But then you step outside and you go up the Prospect Expressway and you go into a different zip code, and suddenly you're in hipsterdom of Bushwick and Greenpoint, or even the Hasidim in Williamsburg. There are countless worlds that you can inhabit. And so that temptation to step outside is always there. And it's so in reach, most
Hmm.
importantly. And
Right.
I really wanted to capture what that felt like as a 19-year-old and a 21-year-old and a 26-year-old, to sort of have that outside world, quote unquote, you know, just outside your doorstep, but then feeling far out of reach at the same time.
Right. Um, Was there one of the, as we've sort of said already, like the three sisters are each kind of on their own journey and figuring out how to navigate tradition and independence, and they're very much there for each other and also competing with each other in certain ways, but have just very different personalities and they've made very different choices. Was there one who you sort of identified with most?
Um, I would say, I don't mean for this to sound like a cop out, but I've definitely been each of these sisters at different stages of my life. And that's what made it so effortless, but also difficult to write. Um, I definitely had the most fun writing Nina's chapters.
Hmm.
It really brought me back to like a very specific point in my own teenage years. And even feeling some of that angst again, it was really fun to put on the page. And to also play around with her arc and maybe do something unexpected with it. And yeah, I think there were parts of like Fortune's story that also brought me back to a certain part, point in my life where I got married at 21 and, thank God I married someone who, is the love of my life. And it was a very deep relationship, but it did bring me back to some of those feelings that I think every young woman deals with and thinks about, as they're engaged or, in the midst of a relationship that's becoming more serious and their life's about to shift and change and you're about to enter a new chapter and all of the doubts that come along with that. So I definitely related to each one of them at different stages, and it was fun to go back and try to inhabit, you know, those different headspaces that I had at
Hmm.
one point or another.
One of the things that was interesting to me about the sisters also is um, they don't really have their own close friends. And at one point, Lucy, they each sort of comment on it at different points. And there's one point where Lucy says, like, well, I have my sisters and that's all I really need. Why did you choose to make them sort of insular in their own way in their family?
So I actually love this question, and I haven't gotten it before, but it's definitely something I was conscious of when I was writing the book. I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is that unfortunately, a lot of times in this ecosystem, there's a fair amount of like superstition and jealousy um, around other women of the same age. And so you will hear from like a grandmother, let's say, who says, oh, you know, don't trust that person per se. Everyone's sort of out for themselves when it comes to men and dating. And a part of me always thought that was really funny. I mean, I don't believe that. I don't think that's always true, but I do think there's something about really putting your trust in your family. And I do think there's like a fair amount of superstition when it comes to, um, keeping your personal life and your secrets close and not letting anyone, not having too many eyes on your personal and your private life.
Mm.
And I think that's very much a cultural thing that I've noticed. And so your sisters really become this fortress for you and sort of unfortunately sometimes the only people that you can trust in this weird way. And Lucy has her high school friends, but then just by virtue of the fact that she's dating this man who is 10 years her senior, she loses touch. She's at a different stage in her life, and you see her grappling with the fallout of those relationships and uh what happens when you sort of skip over certain steps and jumpstart your life and your friends are in a completely different world than you are. um the second reason why I chose to have them be so insular with one another, as you said, is because I really wanted to capture this feeling of like claustrophobia. So much of the book takes place in the kitchen,
Hmm.
in the house, in the kitchen, around the kitchen table. And I really wanted the reader to feel this sense of like, this is the pressure cooker of the home. This is where so much of the arguments and the tension is, builds and happens, but also so much of where like the love exists and the heart of the community exists. And I always say like the kitchen is like the beating heart of the community and of
Mhm.
families. And I really wanted to capture that with the three sisters sitting around and have the reader feel, this is why they have the need or the desire to get out, but it's also where so much of like the magic happens, and where you truly see like this very interesting cast of characters and this family come to life.
Yeah. And it definitely comes through, and there's like such a sense that like even like when the guys who they're involved with are accepted, it involves like being like sitting in the kitchen and being invited in and being part of that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have the older women sort of saying like, what more could you really want than this? This is what it is, right? And like this
Yeah,
is, and they're sort of trying to navigate, like they both understand that and also are like looking beyond in some way.
yeah, yeah. I think there was one scene in the book where two older women are sort of sitting outside of a bakery having coffee, and one of the sisters just remarks on how comfortable and at ease they look. They're just sitting on King's Highway outside of a bakery, talking about whatever, enjoying a cup of coffee. And it doesn't get much better than that. And I think one of the sisters has this feeling like, I wish I can just be that content. And it's sort of like the trappings of privilege and choice, right? And when you don't have the abundance of choice before you, sometimes that makes life easier, and sometimes that lends you a deeper appreciation for the more mundane or banal things that are right in front of you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and there's sort of an interesting point at which some of the characters sort of, particularly Fortune, but I think others too, sort of say like they want to have the right to make a mistake. Like they want to be able to have, which relates to that question of choice, but all and the older women sort of can't understand that. Like the whole point is I want to keep you from making a mistake. Like what would be good about making a mistake? But I think it does speak to that sense of like, well, having some options or feeling like you've had agency in choosing something yourself.
Right. You just want to have the choice to mess, the ability or the choice to mess up.
Right.
Um, and that's part of the messiness of life. But each generation and each person has a different mess, I guess, right? And
Mhm.
so um, the younger generation having everything before them, and not having to grapple with the existential questions of survival that their grandparents had to grapple with, um, lends them an entirely different perspective. And you see that clash of generations and that tug of war between uh, community and tradition and modernity. And I think that's something that Jewish communities all over the world are dealing with. Maybe they've dealt with it on different timelines, but it's that tension is there for
Yeah.
sure.
Um, well, and part of what I really appreciated about your book is it is grappling with those really difficult questions of like how do you balance tradition and modernity? Um, but it's not a simple like, oh, here's this community that's insular, and then here's my story of how I leave it, right? And I think that's so many, and we at JWA, we love to feature all different kinds of stories from different backgrounds, and sometimes it's hard to find ones that talk about traditional communities that are not, the sort of shorthand is like off the derech kinds of books, like books about people leaving the correct path. And this very much isn't that. And that was like very refreshing in a lot of ways that it complicated that narrative of like, okay, there's this traditional thing and then you leave it and you're free or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like I've read so many books by people who, like you said, were OTD, off the derech, and who've left their community. And, there's an element of disparagement then, towards their community, and you understand it. But for me, that wasn't the case at all. I always felt like, you know, two things can coexist. You can love your community and appreciate your community and want to stay in your community and raise children in your community and understand how incredible it is and how rare it is, while also um, pointing out some of the more complicated uh, aspects of it. And that doesn't need to feel like airing dirty laundry. That can just feel like a portrait of a community. And um, I think I did feel, like I said earlier, an immense um, responsibility towards my community because I feel an immense sense of gratitude to my community. But I also wanted to give voice to some of the things that maybe aren't spoken about. And of course, do it in a way that didn't feel disparaging and that didn't feel like I was, you know, taking our trash out for everyone to see.
Right.
Um, and I think humor was a very crucial part of this and part of my process because I felt like there are a lot of difficult pills to swallow in the book, but if you're funny about it, in the way in the Jewish tradition, I'll say, in the way that so many of like my favorite books and movies by Jewish artists are, they then it makes the pill go down easier, and it also like it's okay to like look in the mirror and say, hey, yeah, some of what we do is ridiculous and kind of kooky and crazy, but that's us. And you know, it's part of the beauty and the complexity of who we are. And rather than shying away from that and sweeping that under the rug, we can celebrate it in this way that feels real.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine how scary it would be to try to do that. Especially coming from a community that is very private in a lot of ways. But I did learn a lot about Syrian Jewish traditions and culture from the book. And do you feel like your community, like what is the reception been? Was there pushback or pride or a combination?
So I've been sorry. It's my baby in the background. I don't
I
know
can't
if
hear.
okay, good. Um, so if I told you how many countless nights I spent on such anxiety, worrying about what the reception would be, I was very nervous about coming out with the book and what people would say. And even though I knew that there was so much heart in the book and that it wasn't coming from a place of negativity, just the mere fact that I was writing about this community who is, it's a very private community, was nerve-wracking. Um, but the reception has been amazing. Like I was prepared for the worst, and then I was pleasantly surprised. And people have been so supportive and so engaged. And like I've been to so many book clubs with women from like all ages and um various like levels of religious observance, and it's been really eye-opening for me and um really incredible actually. And yeah, if anyone had really, there've been, of course, there's always a couple of people who are like, I can't believe you wrote the book, but they read the book and they were engaged in the discussion. And I'm open to the criticism, and I'm just thankful that people are giving it a chance and they're reading it with an open mind and they're laughing and they're enjoying it, and it's open dialogue between mothers and daughters, and between sisters and friends and parents of teenage girls. And so it's been really gratifying to see.
That's great. One of the questions in the chat, which was one of my questions too, is about the kind of framing device that you use of inserting excerpts from of material from Fortune's bridal preparation class, where she's learning about the rules of Nida, of family purity. Um, why did you decide on that frame?
So originally, when the book was only from Fortune's perspective, and it was in the 6 days leading up to her wedding, um, I had the 6 lessons of Nida introducing, one for every day. And that was my framework because you have this young woman who, is a virgin and is whose introduction to sex and intimacy is coming through these kala classes and through these rules of nida. As I opened the book up to include to include Lucy and Nina's perspectives, it still felt very relevant um, to have nida be the framework, and that's because nida is and I don't know how. I mean, I'm kind of learning through the process of speaking to so many other Jewish communities, but for my community, nida is a huge part of married life. I mean, even if you don't follow the rules of nida, you certainly don't admit that and you don't talk about it. It is the framework for marriage. It's the framework for a Jewish union. And for a lot of women, a lot of young women, it is the introduction to sex and intimacy. Um, and of course, for a lot of women, you know, they haven't had sexual partners, they haven't been intimate. And so you are placed in this like almost like a classroom environment with other brides. Um, and a lot of times it's a really positive experience where you are exposed in a very like lighthearted way with like a bunch of other like young girls who are also getting married and exploring some of these questions for the first time. But then again, it's simultaneously terrifying, um, and intimidating and overwhelming. Um, and again, I think it was a device for me to really capture Fortune's feelings and her ambivalence and her doubts and her skepticism around marriage and around and using Nida as like a framework for her to ask these questions like is this really the guy that I want to spend the rest of my life with, to embark on this journey with? I think Nida forces you to ask these questions of yourself, and it was really important for me to have that in there. And even though Nina and Lucy are at different stages and not taking these classes and not engaged to be married, um, they're still being introduced to sex and intimacy in their own way. And I think using Nida as, like I said, the tool almost to depict that and to draw some of like the questions out of these characters was useful for me.
Yeah. It's also like such a clear example of rules governing even the most intimate of things. And they're all navigating that question of like what the rules are and what they're supposed to do and how that impacts their like every choice and every way that they are. And
Yeah.
sort of like that in some ways represents like very much what you're supposed to do. And as you're saying, even if you don't do it, it's you still exist in relationship to what you're not doing. And um, that seemed like an interesting voice to kind of have in there in this other form of the text.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing about the rules of Nida is that they're always in flux. And what I mean by that is the rules that you learn as a 21-year-old engaged to be married are the same rules that you follow as a 40-year-old married woman, but they don't mean the same thing.
Mm.
And they shift with you and they change with you, and you gain a new level of appreciation, or the opposite. You decide, hey, this isn't really working for me. You sort of move and shift with the laws as your life progresses and as new challenges and occur and new things enter your life. And I don't want to spoil anything, in the book for those of you who haven't read it, but there is a scene where Fortune's in the mikveh, and it's sort of a ritual to dip before you're married to purify yourself for your wedding night. And she has like an epiphany of sorts in the mikveh. And the mikveh traditionally, we're taught, is a place of epiphanies. It's a place of purification and clarity. And the the clarity or the choice that Fortune makes, or that that comes to her when she's dipping in the mikveh, maybe is not the one that her kala teacher would have liked, or her mother would have liked, or would have expected, but it's Fortune's own. And it's brought on by these laws in this very ironic, unexpected way. And so sometimes the laws don't do what we think they're going to do, or they don't, we don't follow them in the way that we're directed to follow them, in a black and white sort of way. um but if you allow them to like enter your life in your own way, and not, maybe, if you're not so rigid about it, they can be incredibly, incredibly meaningful.
Mm. Um, Shifting gears a little, but staying on that moment, there was a question earlier in the chat about sort of how you chose which scenes to write and which to leave out. So, like, you have that moment of Fortune having this kind of epiphany um, when she's at the mikveh, but then you skip the part where where she tells you what the decision is, and then you're in the scene, a couple days later when she's already made her decision and she's dealing with the aftermath of it. Um, how this is more of a writerly question, I guess, but sort of how do you decide which pieces are the ones that you are gonna write and which are the ones that kind of take place off stage?
Yeah. So this was actually like a hard choice, and I went back and forth with it a lot. And I actually did write the scene. I did have an edit of the book that included her breaking up with Saul, and that scene. But I, sorry, spoiler alert.
That's okay.
But I think that for me, as a writer, and almost as like a mom of sorts to these three characters, it's always more interesting to me the build up to the decision, and then the fallout of the decision,
Hmm.
and the actual act of like making the decision itself. I felt wasn't as interesting as seeing what the repercussions of that decision would be. And so I really wanted to hone in on like, okay, we spent 120 pages wondering what Fortune would do, and sort of watching her unravel. Um, and we get to the mikveh scene where she has this epiphany, and we sort of know what she's about to do. Maybe we're not sure, but we sort of have an idea. But I really wanted to show, okay, now what are the ripple effects of that decision? Um, at that point, for me, Saul was almost an afterthought. And it was more about what's in store for Fortune after, she chooses herself. But does she, does life go the way she envisioned it? What's the conversation with her mother going to look like? How is her relationship with her sisters going to shift or change? Um, what is Fortune going to do now with her newfound freedom, or is it freedom? is it the type of freedom that she expected or wanted, or and so yeah, for me it was the fallout that I really wanted to get into rather than the actual scene of the decision itself.
Hmm. We have a question from Yafa about what your sisters and parents, how they reacted to the book, and whether there were any things you had to sort of like get their permission on or run parts by them.
So I am so lucky that uh, my parents have been like incredibly supportive of my writing, and I've been doing nonfiction writing, and I've written essays that have gotten published, and I had a blog as a young housewife that I've since scrubbed from the internet, but they were kind of used to me writing in this vein. My mother was nervous. I'm not gonna lie. It's funny, like nobody could really talk about it until the book was published. But I knew that they were supportive. And then once the community also got on board, it kind of like made everything, we kind of all took like a collective exhale and we were able to like really celebrate it and enjoy it. My sisters have been very funny because they've just been fighting this whole time about like who's who in the book. Um, like one of my sisters insists that she's Nina, and I'm like, but I wrote the book, and I'm telling you, you're not.
Hmm.
Um, she's so in true sister fashion, we're fighting about which sister is who. But they've been supportive, and they've actually been like incredibly emotional about it, which has been really sweet to see.
You're also one of three sisters, right? And a brother.
Yes, and a
Yeah.
brother,
Hmm.
yeah, who
So
I
was your
joke.
brother like, hello, where am I in this story?
He's like, yep, you didn't include me. That's how much you love me.
Classic. Yeah.
I knew I was your favorite. Like, he's also the oldest sibling, and then he has three younger sisters, and he's kind of used to like us taking up all like the space in the room. Um, but yeah, he's great and very too chill about the whole thing.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, some folks are interested to know if there might be a sequel.
I would love to experiment with a sequel in some way. I don't know if that's like I have to check if this is legal. I would love to like release even like chapters. I
Hmm.
had this like idea in my head of doing like serialized chapters for each of the sister stories because I don't feel like their stories are done yet either.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would love to like experiment with something there.
Yeah. What are you working on now?
I am actually working on a pilot for Sisters of Fortune, which is very exciting, and
Oh,
we'll see what
cool.
happens. Um, and then I'm working on another novel, which is totally set outside of the community, but it's about a group of 40-year-old women who travel to Boca on a tennis retreat for their 40th birthday, and one of them ends up dead. So it's a
Whoa.
satire murder mystery. I'm hoping it'll be really funny in its own way. Um, but yeah, it's fun to like enter a totally new space and world. And I'm excited, and hopefully this next book won't take me 8 years to write. So
Are the characters in the new one Jewish? Can we invite you back to talk about it?
yeah, they're Jewish. They're not like explicitly they're not
Uh-huh.
explicitly Jewish, but they're Jewish. I mean, they're in Boca on a tennis retreat. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, I would love to come back
That does
with
sound
my
fun. Can you tell us also just a little bit about your children's book?
yeah. So my children's book. So I have three children, and when my oldest child Jojo was about 3 or 4, he actually thought that everybody's name was Jojo Chehebar, like him, because he had 5 cousins with the same name and a grandpa with the same name. And so I wrote him this book called I Share My Name to sort of explain to him the tradition of naming after our his living grandparents. Um, and I got it published. And the book is a celebration of this Sephardic tradition of naming after the living as opposed to uh, the the not living. And so what you'll have is in these Syrian and Egyptian families, you'll have the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, and sitting at the table with him or her, you'll have the grandchildren who are named for them. And it's like this really beautiful, moving, living legacy that we get to see in like real time. And the book tries to explain that to a 4-year old. So it's called I Share My Name, and um, it's been it's been a big community hit too. So that's been really sweet to see.
I love that. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Esther, for being with us tonight, for writing this book, and for sharing some of your insights about it with us. Thanks to everybody who's with us tonight for participating and for your questions. As always, there is more to discover at JWA. We have pulled some links for you. In our encyclopedia, you can learn more about Sephardi women in the United States. On our podcast, you can listen to an episode about Jewish culture through food with Syrian Egyptian cookbook author Claudia Roden. In our Women Rabbis collection, you can learn about Rabbi Diane Kohler-Esses, who is the first woman rabbi from the Syrian community. And on our blog, you can read an essay by a young woman who writes about connecting with her identity while rolling grape leaves with her relatives, which I loved it when I found that because that's a scene in your book. That's a big
Love
thing,
that.
figuring
I
out
love
how to really learn how to do that. I hope you will all join us next week. We will be meeting at a different time because our author next week lives in Israel. So we'll be meeting at noon to accommodate her so she's not up in the middle of the night. That will be a conversation with Minna Bromberg about her book, Everybody Beloved. And until next time, take care, everybody, and let's take care of each other. Good night, and
Thank
thank you
you.
again, Esther. It was great to have you.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.